I'm going to talk on the matter of alms giving. And this comes as a result of a recent question, but it's not actually recent in my ministry. It's a question that has been brought up many times before, going all the way back to my early days. And it has to do with that of giving alms or giving to the poor. Now, we're going to see in just a little bit that the Bible actually does teach that there is a responsibility for the believer to share his personal wealth in a sacrificial way to help someone else through a pinch. That is definitely a doctrine that is seen in Scripture. But you have to understand that there is a certain way to go about it. Some poor people don't deserve to be helped. I hope you know that. Some people are poor because they are flat lazy, incompetent, don't care, a thumbing of the nose at society, God, and everybody else, and you owe me something type of mentality and attitude. However, there are others who deserve our legitimate digging sacrificially into our wallet, into our purse, and helping them. However, often it is asked, well, can we give something from the church account to help? Now, remember, as we're doing this, I want us to understand why we shouldn't do that as far as the church books are concerned, the church savings and finances are concerned, but how we should give in another way. Now, the word alms is actually in the Bible. For example, Matthew 6:1, Jesus is speaking, and he is telling us to give alms, but not to do it in a certain way. Take heed that you do not your alms before men, to be seen of them. Otherwise, you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. In other words, you purposely are trying to show how much you give to another person in order to help. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet. Now, when the rich people would go, they would have their own trumpeters and sound the trumpet so that everybody could see how much they were giving. But actually, this is simply an idiom. Don't toot your own horn. That's what it's saying. You want to give? Fine. Give alms. Help out. Do your part. But there's a certain way to go about it. Don't be as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, to have glory of men. They have their reward. Now, they actually do something to help somebody else by giving whatever amount, but it's not to the glory of God, and it's not in their best spiritual interest. They have their reward in a few fickle people saying, boy, look how benevolent they are, philanthropic they are. And yet God says it's a dead work. But when you do your alms, don't let your left hand know what your right hand does, that your alms may be in secret, and thy Father which sees in secret himself shall reward thee openly. So Jesus Christ does tell us that we are to help the poor. Now you have to remember as well that the poor in Jesus' day were a little different. They had a lot different categories than the poor in our day. Some of these poor people were Jews who were oppressed of Rome. They were greatly, excessively taxed of the Roman government, and then the Roman government had their own tax collectors called publicans, who not only took what Rome required, but they'd say, add another 10-20% for me personally. And that's why they were hated. Not only were they treasonous and traitors, and that they were helping Rome extract riches from the Jews, they would also, in a way, a threatening way, and an extortionist way, get more money from them by saying, add another 10 or 20%, and just shut your mouth about it, so to speak. So these people were oppressed of a government. They were oppressed by excessive taxation, and so they needed help. And so Jesus said, give alms. And it is the Greek word, eleemosune, to act benevolently toward another with a legitimate need. Now you have to understand that legitimacy is involved in this word. Because if somebody was poor due to sloth, laziness, they weren't supposed to help. But if somebody had fallen on hard times, as in the case of some of these poor people here, they were indeed supposed to help get their brother and sister Jews through this. Now, there is another word that we need to see, and that is the word tithe or tithing. If you will, please turn with me to the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah, chapter 10. Nehemiah chapter 10, and verse number 38. We'll just go there. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites take tithes. All right? The word tithes, or the word for tithing, is actually asar, and it means to give a tenth part of. Now, while we are here, I want us simply to bypass point number 1. We'll come back to that in a moment, and look at point number 2. Tithes were usually given inside the temple to the priests. Point 1, alms were usually given outside the temple to the poor. Now the point that we're going to make here is that the poor were to be helped, but it was never from the finances that were given to the temple or given to the servants of God. All right, let's look, if you would, at verse number 32. We made ordinances for us to charge ourselves yearly with the third part of a shekel for the service of the house of God. In other words, they were going to even give more over and above the tithe in order to help for the house of God and its service. As you continue to look at verse number 33, it says, for the holy things, for the sin offerings, to make an atonement for Israel, note, for all the work of the house of our God. When tithes were given, they were given to those who kept up the work of the church, as it were, the house of the Lord. We cast our lots among the priests, the Levites, the people, for the wood offering and so forth. We can come all the way down to bring, verse number 36, to bring to the house of our God, unto the priests that minister in the house of our God. What? The first fruits of our dough, verse 37, our offerings, the fruit of all manner of trees, and oil, and so forth. And the tithes of our ground unto the Levites, that the same Levites might have the tithes in all the cities of our tillage. Now, why did they do that? In order that, look at verse number 38, they'll bring the tithe of the tithes into the house of our God, to the chambers, unto the treasure house. For the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring offering of the corn and so forth, so that they might have the vessels of the sanctuary, the priests that minister, the porters and the singers, and we will not forsake the house of our God. Now we're going to look at these other points in just a moment. But the point that we're making here is that tithes were given for the express purpose of the upkeep of the temple. That's why they were given. And they were given exclusively for the use of the service of the house of the Lord and for the servants of the house of the Lord. However, alms were always given before you entered the house of the Lord. There was no such thing as begging allowed in church. It was absolutely forbidden. Come to the book of Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 3. Now, let's just look at an illustration here. Tithes were given inside the temple. Alms were given outside of the temple. Tithes were mandatory. 1/10 had to be given. And in principle, in grace, 1/10 should be given also to the local church. The temple of God in the dispensation of law is a precedent to the local assembly in the dispensation of grace. Now, however, tithes under law were different than grace giving. But still, the principle is the same. Those tithes were to go to the church for the vessels, for the offerings, for the service of the Lord there, so that they might have the candles, that they might be able to clean the utensils, that they might have the oil for the lamps and so forth. However, alms were always given outside of the temple. One was mandatory, the other was voluntary. Let's look. All right. Verse number 1. Now Peter and John went up together unto the temple at the hour of prayer, being the 9th hour. And a certain man, lame from his mother's womb, was carried, whom they laid daily at the gate of the temple. You see, there's a difference. Do the poor deserve our help? Absolutely. But do you take from the house of God in order to help them? You do not. The house of God is to remain solvent financially. And if the poor are to be helped, it's over and above. It is extra. It is a sacrificial free will offering. It is voluntary. Here, giving your tithes, people know about it. But with regard to the voluntary offering, people do not necessarily know how much you give and so forth. He was laid daily at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, to ask alms of them that entered into the temple, who, seeing Peter and John about to go into the temple, asked alms. You see, you weren't allowed to beg in the temple. You had to beg outside of the temple. Why is that? Because as far as the Bible is concerned, if they're truly God's people, they're not, and the Lord is their shepherd, they're not going to want. And the psalmist said his seed is not going to beg bread. There is something obviously wrong here with regard to this. So Peter, fastening his eyes with him, with John, said, "Look on us." He gave heed unto them, expecting to receive something of them. Now, what did Peter say? Now, here's something about helping every poor person with money. Silver and gold have I none. What was the kingdom message at that time? Sell all you have. Did Peter and John have any money? No, it was in a collective kitty to see them through. They sold all their goods, put it in a collective kitty to get them through the tribulation period. He just preached about the great and terrible day of the Lord about to come. This is that which is spoken of by the prophet Joel and so forth. So he said, silver and gold have I none. Poor people need more than just financial help. But such as I have give I unto thee. In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, rise up and walk. He took him by the right hand, lifted him up, and immediately his feet and ankle bones received strength. And he, leaping and walked and entered with them into the temple, walking, leaping, and praising God. Verse number 10. And they knew that it was he which sat for alms at the beautiful gate of the temple. So, did Jesus teach for us to give alms? The answer to that is yes, absolutely. To help poor people out, yes. But it is a voluntary, more private gift than that which goes into the temple. That is the tithe. And the tithe goes strictly for the service of the Lord. Once you begin opening the treasures of the house of the Lord to poor people, what are they going to do? They're going to do the very same thing that they have done to the treasuries of the United States of America. Bankrupt us. It works every time. That is socialism. And you do not do that. You keep your finances solvent. In fact, if it means you paying your bills and not giving to the poor because you don't have enough, guess what you're supposed to do? Pay your bills. It's more important that you have a good testimony of the grace of God meeting your needs than giving your money and the bills come due and you say, I cannot pay because you gave to some poor person who doesn't deserve it. That is ridiculous. It's unbelievable that people do that. You pay your bills first. You put your money into the church first. Then out of what's left over, then you can help others with their problems and their needs. That is the Bible stand. Otherwise, the church begins to look shabby. Bills are not paid. Lights are not on. Insurance is not paid. And it is absolutely wrong. Okay, now, turn back to Leviticus 27. Leviticus chapter 27. Some poor people may be under the very judgment hand of God. And so you have to be careful to whom you give alms, but then especially with regard to taking it from the financial solvency of a local assembly, or in this case, the temple. Leviticus 27:26. Only the firstling of the beast, which should be the Lord's firstling. No man shall sanctify it. What does that mean? Everything that comes to the temple is to be set apart for the Lord and not for anyone else's use. That's it. It is the Lord's. The first thing that opens the womb should be the Lord's. The first fruits should be the Lord's. No man can sanctify it. It doesn't belong to man. It belongs to the Lord. Whether it's ox or sheep, it's the Lord's. If it be of an unclean beast, then he shall redeem it according to the estimation of fifth part, and so forth. Notwithstanding, no devoted thing. That was the tithe. The tithe was totally the Lord's. It was not to be used for anybody's personal business. With the exception of those who took care of the service of God, they were to live of that money. And we'll see that in point number 2 here in just one second. But the point that I am making is, it was to be exclusively used for spiritual ministry. The devoted thing, last part of verse number 28, the devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. None devoted which shall be devoted of men shall be redeemed. You can't buy it back. If it belongs to God, then it's His for the service of the church, and that's it. But shall surely be put to death. All of the tithe of the land, and so forth. Last part of verse 30. It is holy unto the Lord, sanctified totally to Him. If a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall. And now this you have to understand this. If he had to travel a great distance, and he had a lot of grain, he could reduce it to money, but he would have to add a fifth part of that to it. In other words, it'd be a 10% plus a fifth of that. So concerning the tithe of the herd and so forth, the 10th, verse 32, shall be holy to the Lord. Verse 33, he shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And if he shall change it at all, then both it and the change thereof shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. These are the commandments of the Lord. All right, so the point that we're making with this, with regard to the tithe, it was to be given to the temple, or in the case, as the case might be, the local assembly, and that's where it stays for the use of the church, to keep the doors open, the air conditioning in the summer, the heat in the winter, and the lights on, and the insurance paid, and the ongoing ministry. And that is exactly what the scriptures teach with regard to the local assembly in grace. All right, turn to Numbers chapter 18. Verse number 20. Now, these portions here are going to tell us with regard to the servants and service of the Lord's house. Let's read. The Lord spake unto Aaron, Thou shalt have no inheritance in their land, neither shalt thou have any part among them. I am thy part and thine inheritance among the children of Israel. Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tenth in Israel for an inheritance. Do you get it? Who were the Levites? Those who serviced the temple, the house of God. Those who took care of things, the upkeep, the maintenance of things for the house of God. How were they to be supplied? They were to be supplied with the monies that came in through the tithes. And that was to go strictly for the use of the house of the Lord. And also, they were to live on that. Last part of verse 21. For their service which they serve, even the service of the tabernacle of the congregation. Neither must the children of Israel henceforth come nigh the tabernacle of the congregation, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they shall bear their iniquity. In other words, they're going to be responsible for this, and if they do wrong, it's on their shoulders. It's a statute forever. But the tithes of the children of Israel which they offer, I have given to the Levites, verse 24, to inherit. Therefore I have said unto them, among the children of Israel you have no inheritance, but whenever they tithe, you get the tithe. The tithe went for the service of the Lord's house and for the servants of the Lord's house. All right? Now, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 12 rather. Deuteronomy chapter 12. Verse number 5. But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name, even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and hither thou shalt come. And it's there that you bring, verse 6, all your tithes and your offerings and your vows and your free will offerings and so forth. Now, if you'll come all the way down to verse number 19. Take heed to thyself, that thou forsake not the Levite, as long as thou livest upon the earth. Why not forsake the Levite? Because he was the one that was in charge of doing this. And that is another consequence of opening up the treasury of the Lord's house to poor people. Once you do it for one, you have to do it for another. Then another will cry out, well, you did this for this one. And then all of a sudden, the service of the house of the Lord doesn't have funds in order to keep up. And then the servants of God's house. You know, a local church as the temple is a business. It's God's business. But we have to utilize material things in order to keep the business going. And so therefore, poor people are to be helped, but they are never to be helped from the tithes that go into the church, that are specifically designated for the Lord. All right, let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. There is a grace equivalent of this. First Corinthians chapter 9. Now, I've got a friend, and one of these days we'll bring him up here and allow him to speak and play the piano for us. His name is Craig Bruce. We have talked about him before. And Craig right now, I guess, is more or less just going to not take another church. He has candidated in several churches. And in each case, and in the churches he's had trouble with, in each case, the people of the church, in order to get rid of him, did what? Starved him out. They said, we're not going to give if you stay there. Now, you have to understand the situation. He was teaching the Word of God rightly divided, and they just said, fine, we're not going to give you your salary. So he says, I'm going to get a doctorate in French, and wherever I go to be another pastor, I'm not going to be dependent upon the congregation. I will just simply get my money. I'll have a doctorate in French, and I can teach at a local university, and I'll have my money. I won't be dependent upon the congregation. And I try to tell him what he needs to do is be a pastor of a church and allow God to provide his needs. And if a congregation doesn't want to give, tell them what to do with their money. Because that starving out business is nothing but a satanic ploy. Just stand your ground, and if you are right, stand your ground and tell them what they can do with their money. I know I would. The sun doesn't shine where you could place it, because that is nothing but a vicious, mean, satanic ploy in order to hurt God's servants. Now, if a God's servant is doing something wrong, you legitimately go through proper channels to either discipline him or to remove him from office. That's another story. But the business of starving out, well, we don't like what you preach, so we're not going to give. I've got news for you. God says you give to his house for his servants. And that is a command of Scripture. You support it. Well, where do you get that, Pastor? Well, the Apostle Paul is going to use verses from the Old Testament and use them for grace. Look at verse number 13. Do ye not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? You see, there's not a person here that would like to have their salary attached to give it to somebody who doesn't work, who doesn't care, who doesn't deserve it, or to continually drain funds from their career and their business to make it better and ongoing and flourish. There's not a person here that wants their salary attached, but somehow we get the mentality that it's okay to do it to a pastor. And I'm not speaking, of course, of myself. I'm speaking in the case of what's happened to this man. He doesn't want to go to a church and feed his sheep and allow them to feed him. He now wants to depend on external sources. And I say he should simply quote to them verse 13. They which wait on the altar are partakers with the altar. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. And it's not right to take that which belongs to God's servants and to enable them to minister in their business for the Lord and can just simply disperse it with oftentimes people who will not replenish it. And that's another thing I'm going to speak from my own experience here. I once thought that helping poor people was my main job, until I found out that those poor people weren't so poor. They had a scam going. They always had their beer, and they always had their cigarettes, and they always had their big cable color TVs, and they always could get where they wanted to go. But yet the other guy had to work for them, and they were getting from the Salvation Army and from the Rescue Mission and from this charitable organization of St. Vincent de Paul's and the rest of it. And I said, I just simply came to my own senses and said, wait one second. The Apostle Paul says if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. And I am helping that man violate the Scriptures. That is ridiculous. Poor person, if you want food on the table and clothes on your kids, do you know what you have to do? Same thing I got to do. Get up off my haunches and do a little bit of work, a little bit of digging, and so forth. Now, that is the true scriptural view of why we do not take from the church's resources and give to the poor. Give to the poor, yes. There is an exception. Deuteronomy 14, rather. There was a tithe that was given to the poor. But it was given in what's called the year of tithing. Deuteronomy 14. This should be 22. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of the seed in the field, bringing forth year by year. All right. The tithe of everything, verse number 23. You bring it to the place which, verse 24, middle part, the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, in order for you to be blessed, of the God to bless thee. You can turn it into money and so forth. We've talked about that. It was too heavy a grain burden. They could give it to cash, but they had to add 1/5 of it. Again, the Levite that is within thy gates, don't forsake him. He doesn't have a part in your inheritance. In other words, he's depending upon you for his income. You cannot forsake him. At the end of 3 years then, now here, this is what's called the poor tithe, and it was shared. At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase, and lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, the stranger, fatherless, and widows, which are within thy gates, shall come and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God might bless thee. So it was an extra tithe. Remember, they not only had 1/10, but they had 2/10, and then sometimes 3/10. And in this case, the third tithe was shared. But it was never taken from the first 10% that went exclusively, totally, and only to the Lord's service and his servants. All right, chapter 26. And because of our time, we'll not have the time to read all of these verses. But verse number 12 says, when you have made an end of tithing all the tithes of thine increase the third year, tithes plural, and you have given it to the Levite, stranger, fatherless, widows, that they might eat in thy gates, then thou shalt say before the Lord thy God, I have brought away the hallowed things out of mine house, and have given them unto the Levite, stranger, and so forth. I have not transgressed thy commandment, neither have I forgotten them. Now, what is the commandment? The commandment is, I owe a temple tax. That is seen in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts, because they can't pay the 10th to the Lord's house. But they also were to pay part of their tithe the third year with a third tithe, not taking 1 cent less of the 10% for the Lord's house. 1 cent less, they were to give, in fact, 3/10 more in order to have the poor people to share together. And in fact, if you'll note, they also shared it with the pastor. Now that's just a little sidelight, and I'm not saying that for any reason except that's what the scriptures teach. All right, now, come to Malachi 3. Malachi is the last book of the English Old Testament. Not to properly support God's house is robbery. And in fact, a lot of times, as much as we sympathize, as much as we empathize, as much as we would cry tears and weep with them who weep, a lot of times people are in financial trouble and things hit them hard because prior to that, guess what they haven't been doing? Supporting God's work. They've been living high on the hog and I don't need God. And all of a sudden, boom, now we need God. Now we want people to give from the church. We appeal to the church. And that, sometimes it's fine and good, of course. I am teaching here that we should help the poor with legitimate needs. We should help our own. Absolutely. But why do people get in those fixes? It's because they think they can squeak through life without supporting the house of God and the servant of God, and they don't have to come to church and learn the Bible. And then all of a sudden, ouch! And immediately it's out with the hand, please give. All right, verse 7. Even from the days of your fathers are ye gone away from mine ordinances. Isn't that, we just read that the tithes were the commandments and ordinances of the Lord. I've not forgotten them, they said back there in Deuteronomy. That's what you were supposed to say. In the third year, you come and say, I've not forgotten your ordinances. But it says, from the days of your fathers, you've gone away from my ordinances and you've not kept them. You're in trouble now. Why? Because you haven't given to God. Return unto me, and I'll return to you, said the Lord of hosts. They said, wherein shall we return? What did we do wrong? We're such good people. We get a paycheck, and we've utilized all of it for our pleasure. We have a giant fishing boat here and a giant camper here, a great big house back here, and we do this, and we've used all the money you've given us, God. Yeah, that's right. Note what he says. Will a man rob God? Yet have you robbed me. Oh, God, where was your bank? When did I rob you? When did I put my hand in the till and extract from your treasury? Note, wherein have you robbed? Wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. You have depleted, you've drained the treasury of the house of the Lord. You've not supported the house of the Lord, in other words. In principle, the local church and grace. Will a man rob God? Yet you've robbed me. There is not one person you would say, well, you have stolen a dime. Oh, I would not do that. I have integrity. And yet those very same people steal from God regularly in not giving to church. And this is not a sermon on you better give more. This is just, I'm trying to help us all understand why people get in trouble and why you have to be cautious and the priority of what comes first. And it's kept for that reason. And then if there's extra, then you give to help. You are cursed with a curse, for you have robbed me, even the whole nations. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse. What's the storehouse? The temple treasury. That's the storehouse, the temple treasury, that there might be meat in my house. Prove me now therewith, saith the Lord, if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, not room enough to receive. In other words, my house is to be filled first. Honor the Lord with the first fruits of your substance. You take God's 10th off the top and give it, and live with the other 9/10. It belongs to Him, and not to give it to Him is to rob Him. Okay, I want to preach a message, but we're just trying to explain something here with regard to that. I think I'm going to leave this illustration out. We'll just close with this. Do we help poor people? Yes, we do. According to case, according to need. Jesus Christ taught that we should give alms. Now, they can be collectively assembled at the gate of a local church, as they can be individually given at the gate of a church or the gate of the temple here in the alms giving. No begging, no giving for that was allowed inside the temple. In fact, let's go there. Mark chapter 12. I'll just show you one example. Mark chapter 12. And verse number 41. And Jesus sat over against the treasury. Where was he? Inside the temple. The treasury of the temple was in a court on the inside of the temple, and they had their various collection plates, funnels as it were, in the corners there. And if you were a woman, you would go to one. If you were a Pharisee, you go to another, and so forth. And he was sitting there inside the temple. That's where the collection of tithes was. All right, verse number 41. Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse. That's the storehouse. And alms beggars did not get into the temple treasury. If they were to get anything, they got it outside the gate. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing, about 1/5 of a cent. And he called unto him his disciples and said unto them, Verily, this poor widow has cast in more than all they which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. Why did she do it? Because it was an ordinance of the Lord. She gave her all, trusting that God would supply her need. So there are the 2 distinctions, and based on this precedent and principle, the things that belong to the service and servants of God for His house remain exclusively designated for that purpose. Then, though that which is extra according to the case would go to helping the poor. And yes, we do that, but you must be extremely careful not to deplete the power of God's servants to supply for and promote the ongoing of the spiritual ministry, which is by far more important. People get in trouble financially because they are in spiritual trouble, unless, of course, it's a test.